Hey everybody, my name is Tom Tullis. This is the Tomb of 3D Printed Horrors, and I'm finally doing a Creality Ender 5 build video. I've gotten a lot of requests for this. I put off doing it for a few months because I wanted to see what improvements Creality would make to the machine. Creality has a long history of putting out a batch of printers, taking user feedback, and actually taking it to heart and incorporating it into the production line, which is great. I'm not saying anything bad about that process at all. I think that's wonderful that they're doing that. But I've also learned that you wait about 3 months to pick up a new Creality printer just to see what they've done. And they did make some small changes in this Ender 5. The Ender 5 is not a Creality Creality numbering is really confusing. The Creality Ender 4 came out before the Ender 2 or the Ender 3. And the CR20 is not a descendant of the CR10. The CR20 is actually a beefed up version of the Ender 3. So you can't really go by numbering too much. The Ender 5 looks like it's a successor to the Ender 4. It really isn't. It uses a whole different drive system. The Ender 4 is a Core XY, I believe. This looks like it's a Core XY, but it's not. It's actually a straight Cartesian setup. But the Creality Ender 5, it is... I've got everybody asking me which is my preferred printer now, if it's still the Ender 3 or if it's now the Ender 5. And the honest truth is, it kind of comes down to how much you want to spend and what you're looking for. The Ender 5 is a much easier printer to build than the Ender 3. There's less things that you're going to have to measure and get exactly right on tolerances, mainly because this frame is self-righting. You just simply put 8 bolts in the bottom, 8 bolts in the top, and you're pretty much done. And there's no way to screw this up. That said, are there things I don't like about it? Yeah, the wiring situation on this is horrible. There's no stress support for the wiring coming off the heat bed, strain relief. There is luckily a small mount you can get off Thingiverse and print and add on. It takes about 2 minutes. So I'm going to go through all of my suggested upgrades and fixes for this. They're all really easy. Most of them come down just to either printing that one strain support, or in the case of all the wiring back here, I'm going to show you how I arranged my wiring, and it's just a matter of adding 5 or 6 zip ties to the system. But you do want to manage that wiring some. The reason is that the wiring harnesses are so long and just flipping everywhere. They're going to be really easy as this machine is moving around to get snagged on other portions of the machine. And when it does that, you run the risk of the wiring being ripped out. So my build video isn't going to be like my Ender 3 video. On that one, I ran you through a lot of extra steps that I came up with to ensure that the printer went together well, was functioning properly, and didn't give you a lot of headaches. You really don't need that with this one. As far as just generally building the frame, I didn't do anything different than what the instructions called for, because there really isn't anything different to do. Things that we're going to look out for include how the belts attach. This is something I had a problem with my machine. It's really easy to fix. It's just sliding the mount over, but it's something you do need to be aware of. The wiring management does need to be addressed. The only thing really different I did on this was this spool holder is designed to be mounted out to the side. It takes up a lot of room. By flipping the holder over the mount so the smooth side is towards the wiring, you can actually mount it going front to back and on the side, and then it doesn't extend past this LCD panel, which is really nice. It takes up less room then. The only other upgrade I really strongly recommend for this is the same as all of the other Creality printers, and that is putting an aluminum extruder on. It's about $14 from Amazon, but it is well worth it. They still have the really crappy plastic extruder that's going to wear out from the filament eroding it. Although with the way this is set up, it's probably going to take longer to erode, so you're probably okay with that plastic extruder for maybe a month or two. But it is going to wear, and you are going to have to replace it at some point, so might as well go ahead and do it when you're assembling the printer. So other than that, we're going to get started here. I also have another video that I will link here that's going to cover how to install TL smoothers on this. That is one thing I have noticed a lot of comments on online, is that the Ender 5 does suffer from salmon skinning. So I'm not even going to mess with testing it. I'm just throwing on, something fell. I'm just going to throw on TL smoothers to begin with and call it a day. But I've seen this again and again on the Facebook groups for the Ender 5 that salmon skinning seems to be pretty prevalent with this. So we're just going to put TL smoothers on, and like I said, that's a different video, but I'll link it in this one. So let's get started. All right, to get started, I've printed 3 additional pieces off of Thingiverse to add on to this machine. The first one here is a back panel cover for the LCD panel. You don't need this immediately to get started, but it is a good idea to get this added at some point, simply to keep the dust off of your LCD card on the back, since that is exposed. Next up, and this is absolutely essential, if you can print this ahead of time and put it on during the build, do so. If this is your first printer, make this one of the first things you print out and get it added as soon as you can. And this is a strain relief for the heat bed wiring. And the reason you want this, those wires, as you can see in this picture, they'll flex back and forth at the solder joint, and you don't want that, because if that comes loose, you can have a short, and it becomes a potential fire hazard. You want this strain relief bracket added because it will keep that length of cabling between the bracket and the solder points perfectly straight. There won't be any stress on it, and that will help keep those intact and creating a problem for you later on. So make sure you get this added as soon as possible. The third thing we're going to add, and you don't have to do this, I did it. It's a small frame that snaps on the back of your unit, and your cabling passes through it. Where that cutout is on the back of the electronics box, the edges are pretty sharp, and those could potentially cut through the insulation on your wiring. If you don't want to print this bracket, you could simply wrap the wiring at that point in some electrical tape or something, just to add some additional protection. I just went ahead and printed this out. It fits perfectly and keeps everything very neat. All right, moving along. The first thing I'm going to do is install this bracket. You're just going to, or this frame, you're going to feed it through the wiring. Slide all the wiring through, and then it just snaps on the back of the unit. Now, this video is not going to be as in-depth as far as the build process as my Ender 3 video was, simply because Creality did a very good job designing this machine. There's not a lot of changes I'm making. I know in my Creality Ender 3 video, I had a lot of additional suggestions and changes to how Creality recommended assembling the unit. I really don't on this one. There's a few things I've changed, but they're pretty few and far between. So once that bracket is on, the next step is going to be assembling your upright vertical bars. And essential to this process is, you see that side hole on it. Those side holes go at the top of the unit. So when you're bolting these on, make sure those side holes are at the top and not at the base here. These just assemble with the M5 by 25 screws. Rest your lower frame vertical on the table and just start inserting your screws and attaching these uprights. And again, you know, there's nothing special here. The nice thing about this unit is it is self-righting, so to speak. Whereas the Ender 3, you had to be very cautious about measuring your uprights, making sure they were parallel the entire length from bottom to top, because things could go out of alignment. The Ender 5 is self-aligning. Once you get everything bolted together, it's pretty much idiot-proof. So I'm just going to speed through this here, get my 4 uprights on. Next step is going to be attaching the top frame. Now, this comes pre-assembled from the factory. One of the things that you will have to go back and adjust, I know I did, was both the wheel tensions, and I'll go through that later, and the belts on this, and I'll go through both of those later. But for right now, just go ahead and bolt this top frame on. This is again using M5 by 25 screws. Get those hunkered down. You don't want to over tighten these, get them tight, but don't just crank down on it. Remember, these are steel screws going into aluminum threads, and it is possible to strip out those threads. So get it tight, but you don't need to, muscle it in, super tight or anything. There's multiple screws at each junction. Just getting them, hand tight like this is going to be plenty fine. So once that's done, you're going to want to put the Z-axis assembly on. And this is one place I did make a change slightly from what the instruction manual recommends. The instruction manual recommends putting the screws in the bottom of the unit first and then the top of the frame. I'm doing just the opposite slightly. What I'm doing is I'm attaching the unit with just a couple of the top screws. I'm not screwing them in tight. I'm just putting them in a couple rotations. And what this does is it allows the frame to hang at the correct height for properly attaching the bottom screws in. If you don't do this, you have to have one hand holding the frame up off the table and try to keep the two sets of holes aligned while you put the screw in, and it just creates a lot of extra hassle for you. Just tack it in place with two of the upper screws like I'm showing here. Don't screw them in all the way tight. You're going to tighten these after you get the bottom bolts in. But this is just a couple of turns will be enough just to let this hang, and that way you're not having to support its weight when you're putting the bottom screws in. So I've got this in. It's still free floating. It's not tight. And I'm just going to go in now and put the bottom bolts in. And this unit is a joy to assemble. It's much, much easier than the Ender 3. But go ahead and get these tightened down now. And once that's done, you'll go back in and tighten up your top screws. And we'll fast forward a little bit here. Now, one thing I noticed was a bit of a difference on the heat bed is Creality shows only 4 screws attaching it on my unit, and I had one that was released about 3 months after the Ender 5 came out, and I know Creality makes running changes to the production line. Mine had 6 screw holes in it, and they provided me with 6 screws, so I'm going ahead and adding those screws in for this. So go ahead and get those in. Next up, I am adding my strain relief for the hotbed wiring. Now this, you can add this at a later time if this is your first printer. Don't worry about it. It's going to be fine to make a few prints with it as is, but you are going to want to get this made. It clamps onto the hotbed frame, and then you just use a zip tie to secure it, the wire to it. You don't want to make the zip tie too tight. You just want to keep that wire from flexing out of the mount. And then you can use a bolt on the actual clip mount down where it meets the frame to keep it tight. Alright, next step is going to be putting the extruder on. And what I've done here is I'm using a piece of blue tape after I've measured the prescribed distance down to use as a reference point. And that way when I put the extruder on, I've got the right height. Now, I've gone ahead and I've upgraded my extruder to the aluminum extruder upgrade. The Amazon link for this is in the description. This is not essential to do your first day with the unit, but the Creality plastic extruders are notorious for wearing out and wearing down very fast. The filament erodes the entry hole on it into more of an oval shape, and it will cause some under extrusion problems for you. So if you don't have the upgrade to get started with, it's something you're going to want to do probably in the first month or so of operation. But again, those are the red parts on this, but just go ahead and put your extruder on. It's 2 nuts, or yeah, 2 bolts. It has the winged nuts on it that fit in the V, or in the slot of the aluminum extrusion. Alright, next up is going to be the LCD panel. This plugs into the plug closest to the printer when it's mounted. That's the number 3 socket, but it's the one that's closest to the printer. The bolts for this are already attached. You're just going to want to make sure they are loose when you put them in so those nuts can fit into the slots. If the nuts are too far down on the bolt, they won't fit in right. You want to get them as far out as you can without falling off. Insert them into the groove and then tighten up. All right, next thing I'm doing is I am inserting my LCD cover on the back, and if you didn't print this, don't just skip this step, obviously, but you can add this at any time. It just slides on. Now, when mounting the spool holder, Creality wants you to mount it out to the side like this, but this is going to take up a lot of extra room. I'm flipping mine around 90 degrees, having it face forward, but the change we're going to have to make here is put the spindle coming out the back side. As you see here, what that will do is keep that smooth side with the curved edges facing the wiring. That way the ends of the stamped metal bar don't cut into the wiring at all. This won't interfere with your spool moving at all. There's plenty of room on the center spindle, but just mount it like I've shown here if you want to mount it to the front. Otherwise, you can just mount it as Creality wants you to off to the side. It really doesn't make a difference other than how wide your machine is going to be when done and how big of a footprint it's going to have. Now, once that's done, the wiring for your Y-axis needs to be secured loosely to the spool bracket if you're mounting it like I did mine. That way, when the Y-axis is moving, it does not accidentally snag and get caught on the spool holder and get yanked out. So just adding a zip tie here, and you want to keep it loose. You want that cable to be able to move freely under that zip tie. You don't want it tight at all, but what that's going to do is just keep it from snagging. So just do like that. Next up, we're going to tackle wiring. All right, the two wires that could potentially cause you some problem when wiring this up are the two thermistor wires, because every other wiring harness on this is color coded, so they're pretty easy to get matched up, without messing anything up. The two thermistors are identically colored, so you're going to have to go by where they're leading out from. The nozzle thermistor will be coming off the wiring harness that comes from the hot end, and the bed thermistor will be coming off of the heat bed. So just pay attention to those. The wiring that's coming out of the electronics box is labeled, but you're going to have to match it up to the correct one coming out of the correct wiring harness from either the hot end or the heat bed. So just watch out for that. Next up, we're going to attach the X-axis stepper motor, which is on the left, and the X-axis end stop, which is on the right. Once you've done that, you're going to want to do the Z-axis end stop, which is shown here. Just loop it over the top. Below this is the Y-axis motor, and the cable plugs into the bottom of that. This is the Z-axis motor. Go ahead and plug that in. Next up is the Y-axis limit switch there on the left, and on the right is the Z-axis limit switch. We just saw that in a previous photo though, but there it is again from the top. Alright, now this is my big beef with this machine. The Ender 5, the wiring handling on it is extremely long and extremely easy to snag, and that would pull things out. You could potentially pull wiring out of your stepper motors, or if the top gets snagged, you could pull it out of a limit switch, or even your hotbed wiring. So the easiest way to handle this is going to be adding some zip ties, and that's why I'm going to show you what I did on mine. I'm using yellow ones so you can see them really easily. When putting these zip ties on, do not over tighten them. You just want to keep them from keeping the wires, you just want the wires to keep from flailing around. You don't want them snugged extra tight down to the frame. You could have some breakage there. So I'm going to put one up front here, another one at the back corner, but this only includes the hotbed wiring, as you can see here. It doesn't include the Y and X axis wiring. Those don't have enough slack to do that here. Next up, the X and Y axis wiring that's going up that back upright. I'm using two zip ties, again just very loose, but it'll keep them secure. Now, once your wiring is done, this is something I had a problem with on mine, and it was the belt placement. If you look at where the ends of the belts slide in those slots. There is a little room at the bottom of those notches, and on both of mine, my belts were inserted all the way to the bottom of those slots. And what that did was it pulled the belts off center in the grooved track, and as the hot end moved towards one end or the other, and those belts, the alignment got closer to the pulleys, it began to grind more and have more resistance. So it wasn't moving as freely as it did at the middle of the hotbed. So what you want to do is look at all of your belts, where they attach here, and make sure they're about equal distance in those tracks. You don't want them too close to one end or the other, and you just adjust them with those little brass fittings that just clamp onto the end of the belts. You just slide them back and forth in those slots until your belts are, it doesn't have to be exactly centered, but about what you see here in this photo. Next photo here is just showing you on mine, and likely yours unless something changes with their production process. When you have those brass fittings aligned properly, you should have a little gap on the outside of them at the end of the slot. They should not be all the way to the end of the slot. It should look something like this. Now, just as with the Ender 3, the coupler for the Bowden tube on the hot end is it's the same stock hot end on the Ender 3, Ender 2, CR20, and the Ender 5 here and CR10s. And this coupler does not secure very tightly, so this is something you are going to want to change out. I have a link in the video description for an upgraded coupler. They're very inexpensive. I'm also, here is a link for my video on how to change these out. I'm not going to cover that here since there's already a video for it for the Ender 3, and it works the exact same way. But this is something you are going to want to do, because if you don't, at some point the coupler is going to fail. Your Bowden tube is going to slide away from the nozzle. It goes all the way through this hot end down into it about 2 inches and hits the back of that nozzle. And if there's a gap there, that gap will fill with semi-molten plastic, and it will create drag on the filament as it tries to move through there. And when you have drag, you can have under extrusion problems, and you can also have retraction problems, which will result in a lot of stringing. So replacing this coupler is something you're going to want to do, preferably at the build stage, but if not, as soon as you can. Next up is wheel adjustments. Now, when your wheels are perfectly adjusted, you should be able to grip it tightly with 2 fingers, each of these wheels, and turn them slightly with force in the track without moving the assembly. They shouldn't be free spinning, but you should, with some force, be able to turn them. If the only way you can turn them is to move the whole assembly, they're too tight. So what you're going to want to do is adjust these hexagonal nuts. These are called eccentric nuts. And on wheel carts that have 4 wheels, you will have 2 eccentric nuts on one side. On wheel carts that have only 3 wheels, you will only have 1 wheel that has an eccentric nut. And it's the eccentric nuts that you will adjust. Now, how an eccentric nut works is it's off center. So when you rotate it, the wheel rotates in an elliptical orbit around the eccentric nut. And the eccentric nut is what you're seeing here in yellow. So as you rotate the wheel one way, it moves away from the aluminum extrusion. If you rotate it the other way, it moves towards and tightens up. So what you're going to want to do is just rotate it slightly and keep playing with the wheels until you get that perfect amount of tension. And again, it's just tight enough that you don't have any wobble. The wheels are not free spinning, but not so tight that you can't turn that wheel freely with 2 fingers with force. So just play with those until you get those dialed in. Next, you're going to want to make sure this small screw that's on the back of the heat bed is turned clockwise and fully lowered as far as it will go. This trips your Z end stop switch, but for bed leveling and getting this ready, you want to make sure this is as low as it goes. You can always raise it later. Once that is done, you're going to want to compress your bed springs. Now, in this photo, this shows probably about what your springs look like out of the box. This is too high. You want to compress these, and you're going to do this by rotating those large black knobs on the bottom. When looking down from the top of the machine, you're going to turn these counterclockwise. Now, this is very important. You don't want to crank one spring down all the way and not the others. What you want to do is rotate each wheel maybe 2 full turns, then go on to the next wheel, and keep doing this in succession, and that way the bed lowers evenly. So about 2 turns per wheel, and just work around the bed to all 4 corners and then start over again until those springs are compressed about halfway or 2/3 of the way down. Next up, you're going to want to make sure, if you're in the United States, on the back of the machine, have the voltage selector for the power supply set to 115 volt. If you're in Europe, leave it on 230, but in the United States, you need to have this on 115 or your machine will not power up when you plug it in and turn it on. All right, with that said, it's time to turn the machine on. Once you've done this, go to your LCD, go to Prepare, and select Auto Home. Once you've done that, the 4 or 3 axes will auto home. Then go to your LCD again, select Bed Auto Leveling, and hit Next Step. Once you do that, the machine should home at a front corner. Leave it there, and what you're going to do is use a piece of paper, and I have a separate bed leveling video that goes into more detail, and I'll link it here. But basically, you're going to slide this paper under the nozzle, then raise the corner of the bed up until the paper begins to snag. You want to still be able to slide the paper, but you do want to feel resistance. And then go to your LCD, select Next, and it will rehome at the next corner. You go through this for all 4 corners and the center, and do this paper test, raising it up. Now, this paper test will not get your bed perfectly aligned. You have to go through and do my bed leveling test prints for that, and I cover that in the bed leveling video. I'm not going to repeat it here, but go check that out, and once you've done that, you'll be ready to print with your Ender 5. Thanks for watching this video. Please click the subscribe button in your bottom right hand corner.